The year was 1878, and the New Mexico territory felt less like a home and more like a held breath. The land here was vast, a rolling ocean of sagebrush and grama grass that stretched all the way to the purple bruised knees of the distant mountains. It was a landscape that did not care if you lived or died, and that was exactly why Clara Monroe loved it. But lately, the wind carried a new scent. It was no longer just the smell of pine resin baking in the sun or the dust kicked up by wild herds. Now, when the breeze shifted from the east, it carried the acrid, metallic tang of coal smoke and iron. The railroad was coming. It was a black snake winding its way through the ancient grazing lands, bringing with it men who measured the earth in dollars rather than seasons. Clara adjusted her hat, pulling the brim low against the rising sun. She was 22 years old, with skin the color of polished almond from days spent in the saddle and eyes that held the same sharp, assessing clarity as a hawk's. She was not a woman built for the parlor or the kitchen, though she could manage both if forced. She was built for this, the rhythm of a horse beneath her, the silence of the high desert, and the freedom that came with being a speck in the middle of nowhere. She urged her mare, a sturdy roan named Bessie, up the steep incline of the ridge. It was early, the sun having just broken the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and blood red. This was her favorite time, before the heat of the day settled like a heavy wool blanket over the ranch, before the worries of her father's failing health and their dwindling finances could catch up to her. Up here, she was just Clara. At the crest of the ridge, she pulled Bessie to a halt. The horse huffed, stomping a hoof against the rocky ground. But Clara went still. Her hand drifted instinctively to the Winchester rifle scabbarded at her saddle. Though she did not draw it, they were there. On the next ridge over, perhaps 200 yards away, a line of silhouettes cut against the morning light. They sat on their ponies with a stillness that made them look like they had been carved from the mountain itself. Comanches. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. A sudden, sharp rhythm. In the town of Santa Fe and the smaller outpost of Ojo Caliente, people spoke of the Comanche in hushed, terrified whispers. They were the ghosts of the plains, the demons who raided in the night. But Clara did not see demons. She saw men. There were 5 of them. The one in the lead was young, perhaps a year or 2 older than herself. He rode a paint horse with a jagged lightning bolt painted on its flank. He wore no shirt, despite the morning chill, and a single eagle feather was tied into his dark hair. This was Tan. She did not know his name then, of course, but she felt the weight of his presence across the divide. He was not looking at the horizon. He was looking at her. For a long moment, time seemed to suspend itself. The wind whipped at Clara's skirt and the young warrior's hair, connecting them in the same turbulent current. His expression was unreadable, devoid of the savage, snarling hatred the army recruitment posters depicted. Instead, there was a profound curiosity in his dark eyes, layered over a steel core of wariness. He looked at her not as a predator looks at prey, but as a wolf looks at another wolf from a rival pack, measuring, calculating, acknowledging. Clara slowly moved her hand away from her rifle. She sat taller in the saddle. Lifting her chin, she would not show fear. This was her father's land. Or at least, the paper in the tin box under Thomas Monroe's bed said it was. But looking at the young warrior, she felt a sudden, destabilizing doubt. He sat on his horse as if he had grown out of the animal's spine, as if the roots of the grass below were tangible veins running into his own body. The young warrior gave a nearly imperceptible nod, not a greeting, but a dismissal, and turned his horse. The others followed, melting over the backside of the ridge and vanishing into the landscape so completely it was as if they had been a mirage. Clara let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Her hands were trembling slightly, not just from adrenaline, but from something else, a vibration in her soul. She turned Bessie toward home. The image of his eyes burned into her mind. The Monroe Ranch was a modest collection of buildings huddled in the shadow of a limestone bluff. The main house was built of weathered timber and adobe, sturdy but showing its age. The barn leaned slightly to the left, as if tired of standing against the wind for 20 years. When Clara rode into the yard, her father, Thomas Monroe, was sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of cedar. He was a man who had once been as broad and strong as an oak, but the last few years had hollowed him out. His hair was more salt than pepper now, and a persistent cough rattled in his chest like dry leaves. "You were out far," Thomas said, not looking up from his knife. "I'm worried." "Just to the ridge. Pa," Clara said, dismounting and looping Bessie's reins over the rail. She dusted the grit from her riding skirt. "The herd looks good. The foals are fattening up." Thomas stopped whittling. He looked at her with watery blue eyes. "Did you see anything else?" Clara hesitated. She hated lying to him. "I saw a few riders, Comanches, just a small hunting party. I think they kept their distance." Thomas's face tightened, the lines around his mouth deepening. He set the wood and knife down on the bench with a heavy sigh. "You stay clear of them. Clara, you hear me, don't go testing your luck. They didn't threaten me. Pa, they just looked." "Looking is how it starts," Thomas said, his voice raspy. "It is not like the old days. 10 years ago, I could ride out with a pack of tobacco and come back with 3 good mares. We traded. We understood each other." He looked out toward the empty horizon, his eyes seeing ghosts of his own. "But things have changed. The army is squeezing them. The railroad is cutting off the buffalo. A starving man, a desperate man. He is not the same man you traded tobacco with. They are cornered animals now. Clara. And cornered animals bite. They looked proud to me," Clara said quietly. "Not cornered." Thomas shook his head. "Pride is just the last thing you lose before you die. You stay close to the house." Clara nodded, though rebellion simmered in her gut. She took the water bucket to the trough, watching the water ripple. She felt caught between 2 realities, the memory of her father's stories about honorable trades, and the new, sharp fear that permeated the territory. Later that afternoon, Clara took the wagon into town for supplies. The settlement was hardly more than a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings. But today, it buzzed with an agitated energy. A group of men stood outside the general store, spitting tobacco juice into the dust and talking loudly about cattle theft. On the wall of the sheriff's office, a fresh poster had been pasted up. The glue was still wet. It showed a crude, exaggerated drawing of a Comanche warrior with jagged teeth and wild eyes, holding a torch. "Citizens beware." The bold letters screamed, "Report all savage activity to Major Briggs. Reward for information leading to capture." Clara stared at the drawing. It looked nothing like the young man on the ridge. It looked like a monster from a child's nightmare. "Nasty business, isn't it?" Clara turned. The storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, was sweeping the boardwalk, though he was mostly just pushing dust from one side to the other. "It is just a drawing." "Mr. Henderson," Clara said, "paper cannot hurt you." "The paper? No. But what does it talk about?" "That is real enough," Henderson said, leaning on his broom. "They say the Comanches burned a homestead down near the river 2 nights ago. Killed the livestock, left nothing but ash." "Who says?" Clara asked sharply. "Did anyone see it?" Henderson shrugged. "People talk. The army says it was them. Who else would it be? You better tell your pa to keep his powder dry." "Miss Clara, you folks are way out on the edge." Clara bought her flour and coffee in silence. The atmosphere in town was thick with suspicion. Every stranger was eyed sideways. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. It felt manufactured, like a stage play where everyone was shouting their lines too loudly. The fear was real, but the source of it felt slippery, impossible to pin down. When she returned to the ranch, the sun was beginning its long descent, casting long, bruised shadows across the yard. There were strange horses tied at the rail, 4 of them. Army mounts, big, grain-fed bays with branded flanks. Clara's stomach tightened. She hurried inside. In the small parlor, her father sat in his armchair, looking smaller than usual. Sitting opposite him, occupying a chair with the casual arrogance of a man who owned the space he breathed in, was a soldier. "Ah, this must be the daughter," the soldier said. Standing up, he was a tall man, immaculate in a blue uniform with gold buttons that caught the dim light. His boots were polished to a shine that seemed obscene amidst the dust of the ranch. He had a thick mustache, waxed at the tips, and eyes that were a pale, watery blue cold and flat as a frozen lake. "Clara," Thomas said, his voice tight. "This is Major Nathaniel Briggs." "Miss Monroe," Briggs said, offering a slight bow. "A pleasure. Your father has been telling me how you run the day-to-day operations here. Admirable." Clara did not smile. "Major, to what do we owe the honor?" Briggs chuckled, a dry sound. "Direct. I like that. I was just explaining to your father the precarious nature of your situation here." He gestured vaguely to the window. "The Comanche threat is escalating. The attacks are getting bolder. It is becoming difficult for the Army to guarantee the safety of isolated ranches like this one. We have been here 20 years. "Major," Clara said, moving to stand beside her father's chair. "We have managed. Times change. Miss Monroe, progress waits for no one." Briggs walked slowly around the room, picking up a small porcelain figurine from the mantel and inspecting it. "The railroad is coming through. Civilization is following. But until those tracks are laid, this is a war zone. I am making your father a generous offer. The Army needs horses, and we need secure outposts." He turned, his eyes locking onto hers. "I am offering to buy your entire herd, and the land, for a fair price. Of course." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty house. "And what is a fair price?" $2,000, Briggs said smoothly. Clara scoffed. 2,000. The horses alone are worth 3,000. The land is worth double that." Briggs smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "In peacetime, perhaps. But this land is about to become a battlefield. Miss Monroe, if the savages descend on this place, well, land covered in ash is not worth much, and dead horses are worth nothing." It was a threat. It was wrapped in velvet and delivered with a smile. But it was a threat all the same. Clara looked at her father. Thomas was staring at his hands, his knuckles white. He was afraid. Briggs had brought the fear of the town right into their living room. "We are not selling, Major," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "Not the land. We might sell some horses, if the price is right. But this is our home." Briggs stared at her for a long moment. The air in the room grew heavy. He set the figurine back down on the mantel. Just a little too hard. "Loyalty to one's home is a noble virtue," Briggs said softly. "But stubbornness can be fatal. I would hate to see such a spirited young woman become a casualty of war." He put his hat back on, adjusting the brim. "Think about it. Thomas, I will be back in a week. I hope for your sake you have come to your senses by then." He signaled to his men, and they filed out. Clara watched from the window as they mounted up and rode away, a column of blue dust in the twilight. "He wants the water," Clara said, the realization hitting her. "The creek runs right through the north pasture. The railroad needs water for the steam engines. He does not care about our safety. He is buying land for the company using Army money. It does not matter what he wants." "Clara," Thomas whispered, coughing into his handkerchief. "He is the law out here. If he says we are in danger, then we are in danger. Maybe we should take the money. Go east. Live somewhere safe." "No," Clara said fiercely. "We do not run. Not from Comanches, and not from men in shiny boots." But later that night, confidence was harder to find. The moon was hidden behind thick banks of clouds, making the night pitch black. Clara could not sleep. She slipped out of the house, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and walked to the barn. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of sweet hay and horse sweat. The horses shifted in their stalls, nickering softly as she entered. She went to Bessie, stroking the mare's velvet nose. The animal leaned into her touch, a solid, comforting presence in a world that felt like it was shifting under her feet. Clara rested her forehead against the mare's neck. Her mind raced. She thought of the recruitment posters, the lies spreading through the town like sickness. She thought of Major Briggs and his cold, dead eyes. He looked at their ranch and saw a line on a map. He looked at the horses and saw transportation. And then, unbidden, the image of the young Comanche warrior returned to her. Tane. He had looked at her with intensity. Yes, but there had been life in his eyes. There had been a recognition of her humanity, even if they were on opposite sides of a divide. Briggs had looked at her as if she were an obstacle to be removed, or an asset to be acquired. "We used to trade as friends," her father had said. "Now we are enemies." But who decided that? Clara wondered. Did the young warrior decide it? Did she, or was the decision made by men in offices thousands of miles away, and men like Briggs, who profited from the conflict outside? The wind began to pick up. It whistled through the gaps in the barn boards, a lonely, mournful sound. Far off in the distance, toward the mountains, thunder rumbled. It was a low, guttural growl, like a beast waking up from a long sleep. Clara walked to the barn door and pushed it open. She looked out into the darkness. Lightning flashed on the horizon, illuminating the jagged peaks of the mountains for a split second, a white vein of fire against the black sky. A storm was coming. It was not just the rain. Clara could feel it in the electric charge of the air, the tension that had been building all day from the ridge. To the town, to the parlor was about to break. The safety of the ranch, the quiet life she had fought so hard to maintain, was fragile as dry glass. She wrapped her shawl tighter around herself. Somewhere out there in the dark, the young warrior was likely watching the same storm. Somewhere, Briggs was plotting his next move, and she was standing in the middle, standing on the only piece of earth she had ever loved, waiting for the lightning to strike. "Let it rain," she whispered to the darkness. She turned and went back inside, sliding the heavy wooden bolt of the barn door into place. It was a solid sound, a sound of security. But as the thunder rolled again, louder this time, shaking the ground beneath her feet, Clara knew that no wooden door would be strong enough to keep out what was coming. The thunder that had threatened the valley all evening finally broke. But it was not the clean, sharp crack of lightning that woke Clara. It was the screaming of horses. Clara bolted upright in her bed, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The air in her small room was thick and hot, smelling not of rain, but of wood smoke and burning hair. Through the thin curtains, an orange glow pulsed violently, turning the familiar shadows of her furniture into dancing demons. "Pa Luke!" Clara shouted, throwing off her quilt. She grabbed her boots, jamming her feet into them without socks, and snatched her Winchester from the corner. She burst out onto the porch and stopped dead. The world had turned into hell. The main barn was ablaze, flames licking up the dry timber walls with terrifying speed, sending sparks swirling into the black sky like angry fireflies. In the chaotic light, figures moved. Men on horseback, screaming war cries that sounded high and shrill, tore through the yard. They wore feathers and their chests were painted with jagged stripes of red and black, ghost-like amidst the smoke. "Get the water, the water!" Thomas Monroe was shouting from the yard, coughing violently as he flailed at a burning fence post with a wet blanket. Clara ran down the steps, the heat hitting her face like a physical blow. She saw her brother, Luke, struggling with the gate of the smaller corral where the panicked foals were throwing themselves against the wood. "Cover me!" Luke yelled. Seeing her rifle, Clara raised the weapon, searching for a target. A rider charged toward the house, swinging a torch. He wore a heavy buffalo hide mask and feathers in his hair. Clara sighted him, her finger tightening on the trigger, but hesitated. Something was wrong. The rider sat heavy in the saddle, bouncing with a lack of grace that no Comanche she had ever seen possessed. He did not flow with the horse. He fought it. As he neared the porch, he swung the torch too wide, nearly unseating himself. He grabbed the saddle horn to steady himself, a clumsy, amateur move. In that motion, the heavy buffalo mask shifted. He jerked his hand up to adjust it. For a split second, the firelight caught the front of his tunic beneath the disguise. Clara lowered her rifle slightly, her breath catching in her throat. It was a flash of brass. A button, no. It was a pin, a rectangular bar of metal that glinted with the undeniable polish of military issues. She had seen similar insignias on the collars of the officers in town. The man saw her staring and wheeled his horse around, kicking it brutally in the flanks to retreat into the darkness. "Clara, move!" Thomas screamed. A section of the barn roof collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a fountain of embers into the sky. The heat was unbearable. Clara abandoned the mystery of the rider and ran to the pump. She filled buckets until her arms burned, passing them to Luke and her father. They fought the fire for what felt like hours, their lungs screaming for air, their skin coated in soot and sweat. But the attackers did not press their advantage. As quickly as they had come, they vanished into the night, leaving only the crackle of dying timber and the smell of ruin. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, the barn was a skeleton of charred beams. 4 horses were dead. The rest were scattered. Clara slumped against the water trough, wiping soot from her forehead with a trembling hand. The silence was heavy, broken only by the wheezing of her father. Then, the rhythmic thud of hooves approached from the north. "Help is here," Luke called out, pointing toward the road. A column of cavalry rode into the yard, blue uniforms stark against the blackened devastation. Leading them, looking fresh and concerned, was Major Nathaniel Briggs. "Good heavens," Briggs said, swinging down from his horse before the animal had fully stopped. He marched over to Thomas, his face a mask of shock. "Mr. Monroe, we saw the smoke from the outpost. Are you unharmed?" Thomas nodded weakly, leaning on Luke for support. "We are alive, Major, but they destroyed everything." "Savages," Briggs spat, looking at the ruins. "I warned you. Thomas, I told you the Comanche threat was escalating. They are animals. Did you see them?" "Feathers," Luke said, his voice shaking with rage. "Paint. Screaming like banshees." Briggs nodded grimly. "Typical. Striking under the cover of a storm. Cowards." He turned to his men. "Sergeant, set up a perimeter. I want scouts sweeping the ridges. If those red devils are still nearby, I want them found." Clara stood up slowly. She watched Briggs. He was performing perfectly. Too perfect. The outpost was 20 miles away, even if they had seen the smoke immediately. To ride here this fast meant they would have had to leave before the fire had even fully caught. "You got here fast, Major," Clara said, her voice raspy from the smoke. Briggs turned to her, his eyes cold despite his sympathetic smile. "We were on patrol. Miss Monroe, fortune favored us. It seems, or perhaps not, given we were too late to stop this." He walked past her, toward the smoldering remains of the barn. He stopped and nudged a charred beam with his polished boot. He did not look at the tragedy of the dead horses. He looked at the cleared land beyond the barn. He looked at the creek. He looked like a man measuring a new suit. "I am sorry for your loss," Briggs said, turning back to Thomas. "Truly, but now you see the reality. This land is not safe. The army can offer protection, but we cannot be everywhere at once, unless—" He let the word hang in the air. "Unless what?" Luke asked. "Unless this becomes a military asset." Briggs said, "If you sell, we build a fort here. We push the frontier back. We make sure this never happens to another family." Clara gripped the edge of the trough. The memory of the clumsy rider and the glint of brass burned in her mind. It was not a raid, it was a show. A cruel, violent theater production designed to terrify an old man into signing a deed. "We will talk later," Thomas said, his voice broken. "Please, Major, just let us rest." The sun was high and unforgiving by the time Clara woke from a fitful nap. The smell of ash was still everywhere. She went to the kitchen to find coffee, but voices from the porch stopped her. She moved silently to the window, pressing herself against the wall. "Hard for the old man to swallow. I know," Briggs was saying. His voice was low, conspiratorial. "He is stubborn," Luke's voice replied. "He thinks he owes this land something." "And you, Luke, do you share that sentiment?" Briggs asked. There was the sound of a match striking, then the smell of tobacco. "You are a young man with ambition. I can see it. Do you want to die out here fighting ghosts and chasing stray cattle?" "I want a future," Luke said. "I am tired of being poor. Major, I am tired of watching the sand swallow everything we build. You help me, and you will have a future," Briggs said. "A commission in the Supply Corps. A plot of land near the new rail depot in Santa Fe. Real money." "Luke, not promises." Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "What do you need me to do?" Luke asked. "Your father listens to you," Briggs said. "Make him understand that staying here is a death sentence. And I need to know where the Comanche are moving. You know the trails better than my scouts. If we can pin this raid on a specific band, say, the one led by that young troublemaker Tane, we can get authorization to clear the entire valley." "Tane," Luke repeated. "I have seen his tracks near the ridge." "Good," Briggs said. "Excellent." Clara backed away from the window, her heart racing. Her brother was selling them out. He was selling their soul for a uniform and a plot of dirt in town. She needed to think. She needed air. And she needed to check the southern pasture. In the chaos of the fire, the gate to the lower corral had been left open. Several of the surviving horses might have bolted toward the canyon. Clara scribbled a note saying she was going to look for strays and left it on the table. She slipped out the back door, grabbed her rifle, and saddled Bessie. The mare was skittish, smelling the smoke on Clara's clothes, but Clara soothed her with a gentle hand. She rode south, away from the soldiers, away from the lies being spun on her front porch, miles away, on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Monroe Ranch. Tane sat on his heels. He was not alone. 2 other warriors, Black Wolf and Little Crow, were with him. They passed a small spyglass between them, a trophy taken from a soldier years ago. Tane lowered the glass, his expression grim. He had watched the smoke rise last night. He had watched the blue coats swarm the ranch this morning like ants on a carcass. "They did not ride like us," Black Wolf murmured in their tongue. "I went down to the tracks they left near the creek. Shod horses, heavy stirrups." "Soldiers," Tane said. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. "They wear our feathers." Little Crow spat. "They burn a house and call it our work. It is the spider's web," Tane said, standing up. "The blue coat chief wants the horses. He wants the water, and he wants an excuse to hunt us." He looked through the glass again. He saw a lone rider leaving the ranch, heading south toward the broken lands of the Arroyo Seco. It was the girl, the one with the hawk's eyes. "Where is she going?" Black Wolf asked. "Away," Tane said. "She rides into trouble. The blue coat soldiers are patrolling the southern rim." "Let her go," Little Crow said. "She is one of them." Tane lowered the glass. He remembered the way she had looked at him on the ridge. There had been no hate in her face, only a fierce, quiet curiosity. And he remembered the fear in the air last night. The soldiers were not just attacking the ranch. They were attacking the truth. If the girl died, the lie would be complete. The soldiers would say the Comanche killed her, and the rage of the white settlers would be a fire that consumed his entire people. "No," Tane said, swinging onto his painted horse. "If she dies, we are blamed. If she lives, maybe the truth lives." He kicked his horse into a gallop, the others following reluctantly. Clara found the tracks of 2 horses leading into the narrow, twisting throat of the Arroyo Seco. The canyon walls rose high here, red rocks streaked with white gypsum. It was a natural trap, and she should have known better. But she was distracted, her mind replaying Luke's betrayal over and over. She rounded a bend, scanning the brush for the roan mare that had been missing. "Whoa there, Missy!" The voice came from behind a boulder. Clara jerked Bessie to a halt, reaching for her rifle. But it was too late. A soldier stepped out, his carbine leveled at her chest. Another soldier appeared on the ridge above her, his gun also trained on her. They were dirty, unshaven men, their uniforms unbuttoned in the heat. They did not look like the disciplined troops Briggs kept at the ranch. These were the dogs he kept for dirty work. "You are far from home, Miss Monroe," the man on the ground said, grinning. His teeth were yellow. "I am looking for my horses," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. "Step aside. Major Briggs is worried about you," the soldier said, stepping closer. He grabbed Bessie's bridle. "He thinks it is too dangerous for a pretty thing like you to be wandering around. He gave us orders. Said if we found you, we should secure you." "Secure me?" Clara asked. "For your own safety, of course." The man leered. "If you go missing for a few days, well, that would really convince your pa to sell, would it not? Maybe we leave a few arrows lying around where we found you, make it look like you were taken by the wild ones." Clara's blood ran cold. It was a kidnapping. They were going to take her, hide her, maybe hurt her, and blame Tane's people for forcing her father's hand. "Let go of my horse," Clara warned. The soldier laughed. "Or what you gonna shoot me, little girl?" He reached up to grab her arm, his grip bruising. Clara lashed out with her riding crop, striking him across the face. He roared in anger and yanked her hard. Clara tumbled from the saddle, hitting the dust with a bone-jarring thud. "You little witch!" The soldier raised the butt of his rifle to strike her. Thwip! The sound was soft, like a bird taking flight. The soldier froze. He looked down, a look of profound confusion on his face. An arrow shaft was protruding from his shoulder, right through the meat of the muscle. He dropped his rifle, stumbling back with a cry of pain. "Comanche!" the soldier on the ridge screamed, swinging his weapon toward the canyon rim. But Taney was already moving. He did not shoot from a distance. He launched himself from the ledge above, dropping onto the second soldier like a mountain lion. The impact knocked the man flat. Taney rolled, coming up with a knife in his hand. He did not kill the man. He slammed the pommel of the knife into the soldier's temple, knocking him unconscious instantly. The first soldier, the one with the arrow in his shoulder, scrambled for his fallen pistol with his good hand. Clara, still on the ground, saw the movement. She didn't think so. She grabbed a fistful of dirt and threw it into the soldier's eyes, then scrambled back. Another arrow struck the ground inches from the soldier's hand. Black Wolf stood on the rock above. A fresh arrow knocked, his face impassive. "Go!" Taney shouted in English, his voice rough and accented. He stood over the unconscious man, looking at the wounded one. "Tell your chief, we see him!" The wounded soldier did not need to be told twice. He scrambled onto his horse, leaving his comrade behind, and galloped back toward the ranch, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Clara sat in the dust, her chest heaving. She looked up. Tane stood 5 feet away. He was breathing hard, sweat glistening on his bare chest. Up close, he was terrifying in his intensity. But he was not the monster from the poster. He was just a man who had just saved her life from her own people. He sheathed his knife and looked at her. His eyes were dark, searching. He extended a hand. Clara stared at the hand. It was calloused, stained with dust. If she took it, there was no going back. If she went back to the ranch now, Briggs would finish what he started. He would say the Comanches attacked her. He would use her return to spin more lies. Or worse, he would silence her permanently because she knew too much. But if she went with Tan, "They will say you took me," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "They will say I am a traitor." Tane did not lower his hand. "They will say what they want, but you will be alive." Clara looked back toward the direction of the ranch, toward the smoke, the lies, the brother who had sold them out, and the father who was too weak to fight. Then she looked at the open desert behind Tani. It was wild, it was dangerous, but it was honest. She reached up and took his hand. His grip was firm, pulling her to her feet in one smooth motion. "We ride," Tane said, "before more comes." Clara mounted Bessie. She did not look back at the life she was leaving behind. She turned her horse to follow the young warrior into the deep, unknown heart of the territory. The wind picked up again, blowing away the smell of the soldiers, replacing it with the scent of sage and the coming storm. The desert did not forgive, and it certainly did not care about the politics of men. They had been riding for 3 hours. pushing the horses hard away from the crimson walls of the Arroyo Seco. When Tane finally slowed the pace, Clara felt every jolt of the gallop in her spine. She was riding behind Tane on his painted stallion, her own mare, Bessie, having been slapped on the rump and sent scattering toward the river to confuse any trackers Major Briggs might send. It was a tactical decision, Tane had said in his broken English, but it felt like abandoning a friend. Now, she was forced into an uncomfortable intimacy with the warrior who had saved her. Tane pulled the horse to a halt beneath the meager shade of a twisted mesquite tree. The sun was a white hammer beating down on the anvil of the plains. "Down," Tane said, sliding off the horse with a fluid grace that irritated Clara in her exhausted state. She slid down, her legs wobbling as they hit the earth. She reached for her canteen, but Tane's hands shot out, gripping her wrist. His skin was hot and dry. "Not yet," he said. He looked back the way they had come, his eyes scanning the horizon where the heat shimmered like water. "We leave a sign. We must change." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a length of rawhide rope. Clara stiffened, taking a step back. "What is that for?" "You are not a guest," Tane said, his voice flat. "Not yet. You are a burden. If you run, you die. If you run, you lead bluecoats to my people." "I went with you willingly," Clara argued, her chin jutting out. "I left my home." "You left fire," Tane corrected. "Fire burns. Fear makes people run back to fire." Without waiting for her permission, he took her wrists. He did not wrench them, but his grip was iron. He bound her hands in front of her. It was not a tight knot. There was enough slack for her to hold the saddle horn or wipe her face, but it was a symbol. It was a reminder that she had stepped out of the world of laws and written deeds into a world of survival. "Get up," he commanded. He lifted her back onto the horse, settling her behind the saddle this time, then mounted in front of her. The space between them was charged. Clara had to wrap her bound arms around his waist to keep her balance. She could feel the muscles of his back shift beneath his buckskin shirt. He smelled of sage, horse sweat, and wood smoke, an earthy, ancient scent that was purely masculine. It was terrifying, and yet, compared to the cloying cologne Major Briggs wore, it felt honest. They rode deeper into the Badlands, a landscape of fractured earth and towering hoodoos that looked like goblin fingers pointing at the sky. By late afternoon, the sky began to change. The relentless blue was swallowed by a bruising purple on the western horizon. The wind, which had been a steady nag all day, suddenly died. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against Clara's eardrums. Tane tensed. He kicked the horse into a trot, heading toward a cluster of boulders near a dry wash. "What is it?" Clara asked, shouting over the sudden roar of wind that exploded out of nowhere. "Dust!" Tane shouted back. It hit them seconds later. It was not just wind. It was a wall of solid earth. The sky turned a sickly ochre color, blotting out the sun. Sand and grit slammed into them with the force of birdshot. The horse whinnied in panic, dancing sideways. Tane dragged the horse into the lee of the rocks and practically pulled Clara off. "Get down!" he yelled, his voice barely audible over the screaming wind. He forced her into the crevice between two large boulders, pushing her down until she was curled into a ball. Then he did something she did not expect. He did not cower beside her. He positioned himself over her, his back to the wind, spreading his heavy buffalo hide cloak to create a tent. Clara gasped as the world went dark. She was enclosed in a small, warm space, pressed into the dirt. Above her, Tane took the brunt of the storm. She could hear the sand scouring the leather of his cloak, sounding like a million angry insects. She lay there, her cheek against the grit, trembling. All her life, the preachers and the newspapers had told her that the Comanche were devils who would scalp a woman as soon as she saw her. They were savages, devoid of mercy. But the savage was currently using his own body as a shield to keep her from being flayed alive by the wind. She shifted, looking up. In the dim light filtering through the cloak, she could see the outline of his face. His eyes were closed, His jaw set in a grim line as he braced against the gale. He was shaking slightly from the effort of holding the position against the battering wind. "Why?" she whispered, though she knew he could not hear her. "Why save the daughter of the man who took your land? Why shield the sister of the man who betrayed you?" The storm raged for 2 hours. For 2 hours. Taine did not move. He became a statue of protection. Clara felt a strange sensation blooming in her chest, a mixture of shame for her prejudice and a grudging, profound gratitude. She realized, with a start, that she felt safer here, trapped under a buffalo robe in a sandstorm with a Comanche warrior, than she had felt in her own parlor with Major Briggs. When the wind finally died, it ended as abruptly as it had begun. Taine threw the cloak back, sending a cascade of red sand sliding onto the ground. He coughed, spitting dust, and stood up, offering a hand to pull her out. He looked at her, his face streaked with dust, his dark hair wild. He reached out and brushed a patch of sand from her shoulder. The gesture was fleeting, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through Clara that had nothing to do with fear. "We go," was all he said. They reached the valley at twilight. It was a place invisible from the high plains, a deep gash in the earth where a spring-fed creek allowed cottonwood trees to grow tall and green. As they descended the narrow, winding trail, the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke rose to meet them. Clara's heart began to hammer again. This was it, the belly of the beast. As they rode into the camp, silence rippled outward like a wave. Conversation stopped. Women looked up from their cooking fires. Men sharpening arrows ceased their work. Dozens of pairs of dark eyes fixed on Clara. There was no welcome in them. There was only hard, cold suspicion. Taine rode to the center of the circle of lodges and dismounted. He helped Clara down, but he did not untie her hands. He kept a grip on her arm, parading her forward not as a prisoner, but not quite as a guest either. An old man emerged from the largest lodge. He was stooped, his face a map of deep wrinkles that looked like the dry riverbeds of the territory. He wore a blanket wrapped around his thin shoulders and carried a staff adorned with eagle feathers. This was Red Elk. He stopped 5 feet from them, his gaze piercing. He did not look at Clara. He looked only at Tan. He spoke in Comanche, his voice raspy and sharp. The words sounded like stones grinding together. Clara looked at Taine. His posture had changed. He stood straighter, his chin lifted, respectful but defiant. He answered the elder, his tone urgent. Clara caught the gesture Taine made toward the north, toward the smoke that would still be rising from her father's ranch. Red Elk spat on the ground. He pointed a bony finger at Clara, his voice rising in anger. "What is he saying?" Clara whispered, fear clutching her throat. Taine did not look at her. "He asks why I bring the daughter of the gunmen here. He says you carry the sickness of the white man. He says you are a spy." "Tell him I am not," Clara hissed. "Tell him the soldiers burned my home too." Taine spoke again to the elder. He gestured to the sky, then to the earth. "I tell him," Taine murmured to Clara, translating loosely. "I tell him the wind brings white fire. I tell him the soldiers wear our faces to do bad things. I tell him you saw the truth." Red Elk stepped closer to Clara. He smelled of sage and old leather. He looked into her eyes with a terrifying intensity, searching for deceit. Then he turned back to Taine and barked a short, final question. Taine hesitated. He looked at Clara, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at the elder and nodded once. Slowly, he placed his hand over his own heart. The elder grunted. He turned his back on them and walked back into his lodge. The tension in the camp broke, though the hostility remained. "What did he ask?" Clara demanded as Taine led her away toward a smaller, solitary teepee near the edge of the creek. "He asked if I swear for you," Taine said quietly. "He asked if I would give my blood for your blood." Clara stopped. "And you said yes?" "I said yes." Taine turned to her, and for the first time, he untied the leather thong binding her wrists. The blood rushed back into her fingers, stinging. "If you run, Clara Monroe, They will kill me. If you lie, they kill me. Do not make me a dead man." It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange on his tongue. Heavier, more significant. "I will not run," Clara said, rubbing her wrists. "I promise." Tane studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Sleep. Tomorrow. We work." Clara did not sleep immediately. She sat at the opening of the small lodge Tane had assigned to her. It was spare, containing only a pile of furs and a small water skin, but it was dry and clean. From her vantage point, she watched the camp settle in for the night. It was a revelation. She had expected a war camp, a place of blood and sharpening steel. Instead, she saw a community. She saw a mother laughing as she chased a naked toddler who had escaped his bath in the creek. She saw two young men wrestling near a fire, not in anger, but in high spirits, cheered on by a group of giggling girls. She saw an old woman carefully beating a pair of moccasins, her gnarled hands moving with practiced dexterity. These were the people Major Briggs called vermin. These were the people the townspeople said ate children. They were families. They were people holding onto the edge of the world with their fingernails, trying to keep their children fed and their stories alive. As the moon rose, turning the canyon silver, the drums began. It was a soft, rhythmic heartbeat thrum. Thrum. Thrum, thrum. A voice rose in song, high and mournful. Clara did not need a translator to understand the song. It was a song of loss. It sounded exactly like her father looked when he stared at the deed to their ranch. It was the sound of a man watching his world shrink. Tears pricked Clara's eyes. She felt a profound sense of dislocation. She was a white woman, Monroe, sleeping in the camp of the enemy. By all laws of her society, she was a traitor. If Luke saw her now, he would shoot her. But Luke was the one who had sold them out. Luke was the one drinking whiskey with the man who burned their barn. Where did loyalty lie? Was it to blood, even when that blood was tainted, or was it to the truth? She felt a shadow fall across the entrance of her lodge. She looked up. Tane was there. He did not come in. He sat cross-legged on the ground outside, his back to her, his rifle laid across his knees. He was guarding her. "Tane," she whispered. He did not turn around. "Go to sleep. Clara." "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Why pledge your life to mine?" He was silent for a long time. She thought he might not answer. "Because," he said, his voice low, blending with the sound of the creek. "When the storm came, you did not cry. When the soldier aimed his gun, you did not beg. You have a warrior's heart. We need warriors, even white ones." Clara lay back on the furs, pulling the buffalo robe up to her chin. Outside, the drums continued their slow, sad beat. She watched the silhouette of the young Comanche against the stars. He was a barrier between her and the camp, but also a barrier between her and the world she had left behind. She realized with a terrifying clarity that she did not want him to move. She felt safer with him sitting there, guarding her sleep, than she had ever felt in her life. The conflict in her mind raged fear of the future, guilt over her father, anger at Briggs, but her body was exhausted. As her eyes drifted shut, the last thing she saw was the steady, unmoving set of Tane's shoulders. He was the rock in the river, and for tonight, she would hold on to the rock. The next morning broke with a deceptive calm. The air in the valley was cool and smelled of pine resin. Clara woke to the sound of chopping wood. She emerged from the lodge, blinking in the light. The camp was already active. Tane was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a young woman approached her. She was about Clara's age, with broad cheekbones and heavy braids. She carried a wooden bowl filled with a mush made of corn and dried berries. She thrust it at Clara without a smile, but without malice either. "Eat," the woman said in English, the word heavily accented. "Thank you," Clara said, taking the bowl. "Where is Tane?" The woman pointed toward the edge of the clearing where the horses were kept. Tane was there, working with a young colt. Clara ate quickly, the food warm and filling, and walked toward the corral. As she approached, She saw Tane speaking with two other men. They were looking at a map drawn in the dirt. They stopped abruptly when she arrived. "You slept," Tane said. It was not a question. "I did," Clara said. "Thanks to you." Tane ignored the gratitude. He pointed to the map in the dirt. "Soldiers move. Scouts see dust to the south, near the big rock." Clara frowned, looking at the scratchings in the earth. "Big rock? You mean Chimney Rock?" Tane nodded. "They move heavy guns, cannons." Clara felt a chill. "Cannons? Why would they need cannons for a patrol?" "Not patrol," Tane said grimly. "They clear the way. For the Iron Road." Clara looked at him, realizing the scope of what was happening. Briggs wasn't just chasing raiders. He was waging a full-scale campaign to exterminate them from the valley before the railroad surveyors arrived. And he was using the burning of the Monroe Ranch as his justification. "My father," Clara said, her voice trembling. "If Briggs is moving cannons, he is using the ranch as a staging ground. My father is right in the middle of it." "Your father chose his side," Tane said hard. "He was tricked." Clara snapped. "Just like you are being framed. We have to stop it." Tane looked at her, his dark eyes skeptical. "Yesterday you were a burden. Today you want to fight soldiers." "I know how they think," Clara said, stepping closer to him. "I know Briggs. I know his vanity. And I know the terrain around my ranch better than any of your scouts. You saved me because you said I had a warrior's heart. Well, use it." Tane studied her face. The morning sun caught the amber flecks in her eyes. The suspicion in his gaze warred with something else respect, perhaps. "Red Elk says you are poisonous," Tane said softly. "Red Elk does not know me." Clara replied, "Do you think I am poisonous?" Tane looked down at her. The distance between them was less than 2 feet. She could see the pulse beating in his throat. "I think," Tane said slowly, "that poison can also be medicine. It depends on the dose." He kicked dirt over the map. "Come," he said. "If you want to fight, you must learn to shoot a bow. A rifle makes too much noise." He turned and walked toward the practice field. Clara watched him go, her heart pounding. She was terrified. She was out of her depth, but as she looked at his broad back, she knew she would follow him. She had crossed the line, and there was no going back. The storm was coming, and this time, she would not be hiding under a cloak. She would be standing in the wind. Over the next 2 weeks, the valley became Clara's world, and Tane became her tether to it. The life she had known of starched collars, Sunday church bells, and the rhythmic scratching of her father's pen in the ledger felt like a skin she had shed. In its place grew calluses. The smell of wood smoke permanently seeped into her hair, and a silence that was louder than any conversation. Tane was a relentless teacher. He did not instruct with words so much as with expectations. He would point, demonstrate, and wait. "Look," he said one morning, crouching beside a patch of dry earth near the creek bed. Clara knelt beside him. The ground looked like ground, dust, pebbles, a few blades of dying grass. "I see dirt," Clara said, wiping sweat from her forehead. The sun was not yet high, but the heat was already rising, shimmering off the canyon walls. "You see dirt." "I see the story," Tane said. He traced a faint depression in the soil with a long, brown finger. "Here, horse, shod, iron shoe, heavy step." He moved his hand 3 inches to the left. "Here, pony, unshod. The hoof is cracked on the left side. Lighter." Clara squinted, leaning closer. Slowly, the chaotic patterns of the earth began to resolve into shapes. She saw the crescent of the iron shoe, the way it cut deeper into the sand than the natural hoof. "Soldier?" she asked. "Scout," Tane corrected. "Soldier rides in line. Heavy, stupid. Scout rides alone. Stop to look. See the shift, the horse turned here, then back." The rider was looking at the ridge. He stood up, wiping his hands on his buckskin breeches. "Smell." Clara inhaled deep through her nose. "Sage, dust, horse manure. Deeper," Tane commanded. She closed her eyes, blocking out the visual noise of the camp. She breathed in the air of the valley. Sage. Yes, the sweet rot of cottonwood leaves near the water. The sharp tang of curing leather from the women's work area. And something else. Something acrid and foreign. Sulfur, she guessed, opening her eyes. Tane nodded, a rare flicker of approval in his dark eyes. Gun oil and tobacco, the cheap kind, the kind soldiers buy in sacks. He looked toward the canyon entrance. Wind carries it. If you can smell them, they are too close. If you can see them, it is too late. Clara flushed with a strange pride. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. She was learning to read the world the way he did, not as a landscape to be conquered or owned, but as a living text to be understood. However, her education with weapons was less successful. Later that afternoon, Tane handed her a short bow made of ash wood. "Pull," he said. Clara gripped the wood, fitted the arrow as she had seen the other women do, and pulled. The string bit into her fingers. Her arm shook. She released the string. The arrow flopped pathetically onto the ground, 3 feet away. Tane did not laugh, which somehow made it worse. He just picked up the arrow. Again, after an hour, Clara's fingers were raw and bleeding, and she had not hit the target, a bundle of straw, even once. She threw the bow down in frustration. "I cannot do it," she snapped, her temper flaring. "I am not a warrior. Tane, I am a rancher's daughter. I can balance a ledger. I can birth a foal. I can shoot a Winchester if I have a rest for it. But this is useless." Tane looked at the bow in the dust, then at her. He stepped close, invading her personal space. He smelled of pine resin and exertion. "The rifle runs out of bullets," he said quietly. "The bow asks only for wood and string. The rifle makes a noise like thunder, telling the world where you are. The bow whispers." "I do not have the strength," Clara said, rubbing her aching arm. "It is not strength," Tane said. He reached out and touched her shoulder, then her elbow, adjusting her stance. His touch was warm, firm, and impersonal. Yet Clara felt her breath hitch. "It is the back. You pull with the arm. You must pull with the spirit, with the bone." He stood behind her, guiding her hands. For a moment, his chest pressed against her back. She could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blade. The world narrowed down to the sensation of his skin against hers, the rough texture of his hands over her smooth ones. "Breathe," he whispered near her ear. Clara breathed. She drew the string back, and this time, guided by his strength, the bow bent deep. She was released. The arrow flew true, thumping into the straw bundle. Tane stepped back immediately, breaking the contact. The air suddenly felt cold where he had been. "You have eyes," Tane said, changing the subject as if the moment of intimacy had not happened. "You see things I do not. You saw the brass pin on the soldier who burned your barn. My men saw only a mask." "I noticed details," Clara admitted. "My father says I think too much." "Thinking is good," Tane said. "We have many strong arms. We have few who know the mind of the bluecoats. You know their trails." "I know where they patrol," Clara said, her mind shifting back to the map in her head. "I know Major Briggs follows the regulations. He sends patrols out at 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. He sticks to the flat ground because he hates getting dust on his uniform, and he uses the old surveyor markers to navigate." Tane nodded slowly. "Then you are a weapon. Clara Monroe, just not a bow." 3 days later, the need for that weapon became real. Tane decided they needed to see how far the railroad survey had progressed. They rode out before dawn, just the two of them, leaving the safety of the valley for the high, exposed plains to the east. They moved like ghosts. Tane had taught her how to ride in the washes and gullies, keeping below the skyline. He taught her to wrap Bessie's hooves in burlap sacks to muffle the sound on the rock. By midday, they reached the rise overlooking the eastern flats. What Clara saw made her stomach turn. A line of wooden stakes, tipped with red flags, stretched across the prairie like a jagged scar. They went right through the heart of the winter grazing lands, and every half mile, a heavy wooden post had been driven into the ground. The iron snake's teeth, Tane murmured, his face hard as stone. They rode closer to one of the posts. Tucked under a rock to keep it from blowing away was a piece of paper. Clara dismounted and retrieved it. It was a wanted poster. Wanted dead or alive. The bold block letters screamed. The renegade Comanche known as Tane, for murder, arson, and the kidnapping of Miss Clara Monroe. Reward $500. Clara stared at the paper. The drawing of Tane was crude, making him look like a beast with snarling lips. But the words, kidnapping. "They think you took me," Clara said, her voice hollow. "They think you dragged me screaming from the ranch." Tane leaned down from his horse and plucked the paper from her hand. He looked at it, though he could not read the words. He understood the picture. He understood the number at the bottom. $500, Clara translated softly. "That is a lot of money. Enough to make a poor man do bad things." Tane crumpled the paper in his fist. "They paint me with blood so they can kill me with the law." "Briggs knows I left willingly," Clara said, anger rising in her chest. "He knows I saw the brass pin. He has to silence us both. If he kills you and rescues me, he can say I was delirious from the trauma. He can spin the story however he wants." "Then we do not let him," Tane said. He tossed the crumpled paper into the wind. "We go back. We tell Red Elk. The stakes are closer than we thought." They turned the horses, but the wind had shifted. It was blowing from the north now, carrying sound, a crack, sharp and dry like a snapping branch, echoed across the plains. Dust kicked up 2 inches from Bessie's front hoof. "Ride!" Tane screamed. He did not wait. He slapped Bessie's rump hard. The mare bolted. A second later, the boom of a heavy-caliber rifle rolled over them. Clara crouched low over the horse's neck, her heart leaping into her throat. She glanced back. 3 riders were cresting the rise they had just left. They were not in uniform. They wore duster coats and wide-brimmed hats. Scouts, hired guns, the kind of men who did not follow regulations. "Head for the broken ground," Tane shouted, pointing toward a labyrinth of sandstone pillars a mile to the west. They galloped flat out. The wind roared in Clara's ears. Another bullet whined past her head, sounding like an angry hornet. It was terrifyingly close. These men were not shooting to warn. They were shooting to kill. Bessie was fast, but she had been ridden hard that morning. She was breathing heavily. Tane's painted stallion was pulling ahead, but he checked his speed, falling back to ride alongside Clara, placing his body between her and the shooters. "Do not stop," Tane yelled. "Do not look back." They hit the edge of the rocks at a breakneck pace. Tane guided them into a narrow canyon, the walls rising up sheer and red on either side. The path twisted and turned, forcing them to slow down. "They are tracking us," Tane said, pulling his horse to a skidding halt. He listened. The hoofbeats behind them were getting louder. "They have fresh horses. We cannot outrun them in the open." He looked around wildly. The canyon walls were steep, but halfway up the left side, there was a fissure, a dark crack in the stone face caused by centuries of erosion. "Off the horses," Tane ordered. "What?" Clara gasped. Sliding down. "We cannot leave them. We send them on," Tane said. He slapped the stallion hard on the flank and shouted a command in Comanche. The well-trained war horse bolted down the canyon, and Bessie, following the herd instinct, galloped after him. Tane grabbed Clara's hand. "Up, now!" He pulled her toward the rock face. They scrambled up a slope of loose shale, the stones sliding and clattering under their boots. Clara gasped for breath, her lungs burning. Every slip felt like a death sentence. "Faster!" Tane urged, his grip on her hand bruisingly tight. They reached the fissure just as the first pursuer rounded the bend below. Tane shoved Clara into the darkness of the crack. It was tight, barely wide enough for 2 people. He squeezed in after her, dragging a piece of dead tumbleweed across the opening to obscure it. "Down!" he hissed. He pressed her back against the cold stone floor of the crevice. The space was so narrow that he had to lie on top of her, his body covering hers completely. Clara lay frozen. The rock bit into her shoulder blades. Above her, Taney was a heavy, solid weight. She could feel the heat radiating from him, soaking through his buckskin shirt and her cotton dress. Below them, the riders slowed. "Where did they go?" a voice growled. It was a rough, gravelly voice. "Tracks go deeper," another man said. "Horses are running hard." "I do not see them," the first man said. "Keep your eyes peeled. That buck is worth $500, and the major wants the girl alive if possible. If not, well, accidents happen." Clara stopped breathing. Tears of terror pricked her eyes. They were right below them. If she coughed, if she shifted, if a rock slid, it was over. She felt a tremor start in her hands. It spread to her arms, then her chest. It was an uncontrollable shaking, a physical reaction to the adrenaline dumping into her blood. She was vibrating against the stone. She looked up. Tane's face was inches from hers. In the gloom of the crevice, his eyes were wide, the pupils blown black. He was tense as a coiled spring. His head turned slightly to listen to the men below. She could feel his heart hammering against her chest. It was beating as fast as hers. He was afraid too. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He was not a myth. He was a young man, 24 years old, lying in the dirt, hiding from men who wanted to sell his scalp for money. The shaking got worse. Her teeth threatened to chatter. She clamped her jaw shut, but her body betrayed her. "I'm shaking," she whispered, the sound barely a breath. A confession of her own weakness in the face of death. Taney looked down at her. His gaze locked onto hers. He shifted his weight, pressing harder against her, grounding her. His hands moved from the dirt to grip her shoulders, his fingers digging into the fabric of her dress. "Then I'll shake with you," he whispered back. He lowered his head until his forehead rested against her shoulder, hiding his face in the curve of her neck. He held her. He did not try to stop the trembling. He joined it. For a long, suspended moment. They lay there, intertwined in the dark. The sounds of the horses below faded as the scouts rode further up the canyon, chasing the decoys. But Taney did not move. The shaking transformed. It was no longer just fear. It was the electric current of being alive when you should be dead. It was the heat of his body, the scent of his skin, the rough stubble on his jaw grazing her neck. It was an intimacy more profound than anything Clara had ever known. There were no social barriers here, no Indian and white woman, just two terrified hearts beating against the same patch of earth. Clara's hands, which had been clenched at her sides, slowly uncurled. She reached up, her fingers trembling, and touched the back of his head. His hair was thick and coarse. She wove her fingers into it, pulling him slightly closer, anchoring him to her as he anchored her to the ground. "They are gone," she breathed, though she made no move to push him away. "Wait," Taney murmured against her skin. They lay there for another 10 minutes, waiting for the silence to return to the canyon. The shaking slowly subsided, replaced by a heavy, languid awareness. Clara became acutely aware of the weight of his hips, the breadth of his shoulders, the way their legs were tangled together in the cramped space. Finally, Taney lifted his head. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was raw. The stoic mask was gone. He looked at her mouth, then her eyes. "You are safe," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Because of you," Clara said. He pushed himself up, groaning slightly as his muscles protested the tension. He offered her a hand, just as he had in the sandstorm. But this time, when their fingers interlaced, there was no hesitation. They climbed out of the fissure into the blinding afternoon sun. The canyon was empty. "The horses?" Clara asked, brushing the red dust from her skirt. "They will circle back," Tane said. "My stallion knows the way home. We walk." The walk back to the valley took hours. They moved in silence, but it was not the awkward silence of strangers. It was a companionable silence. When the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the grass, Tane stopped. He unslung his waterskin and handed it to her first. Clara took a drink and handed it back. Their fingers brushed. Tane did not pull away. He held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. "Your arm," he said, pointing to a scrape on her elbow where the shale had cut her. "It is nothing," Clara said. "It is blood," Tane said. He took a strip of clean cloth from his pouch and tied it around her arm. His touch was gentle, almost reverent. "You did good today. Clara, you did not scream." "I wanted to," Clara admitted with a weak smile. "Wanting is fear," Tane said, tightening the knot. "Not doing it is courage." They reached the camp well after dark. The horses had indeed returned. Clara saw Bessie grazing near the creek, her reins trailing. Clara went to the fire and ladled out a bowl of stew. She brought it to where Tane was sitting by his lodge, cleaning his rifle. She did not hand it to him and walked away as she usually did. She sat down beside him. "Eat," she said. "You carried the weight of both of us today." Tane took the bowl. He looked at the stew, then at her. He took a piece of dried meat from his own pouch, a rare treat, and placed it in her bowl. "We shake together," he said softly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "We eat together." Clara ate the meat. It was tough and salty, but it tasted better than any roast beef dinner she had ever served in fine china. She sat beside him as the stars wheeled overhead, feeling the phantom pressure of his body still pressing against hers, knowing that something fundamental had shifted in the dark crack of the canyon. They were no longer just allies of convenience. They were something else, something undefined, dangerous, and undeniably real. The peace of the valley was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the sight of a wheel rut. It was 3 days after the ambush in the canyon. Tane and Clara lay on their bellies on a high ridge overlooking the southern approach to the Comanche hideout. Below them, the desert floor was scarred with fresh tracks. These were not the prints of scouts or single riders. These were deep, gouged lines in the earth, the kind made by heavy wagons groaning under immense weight. "Supply wagons," Clara whispered, lowering the spyglass Tane had liberated from a soldier months ago. "Too heavy," Tane said, his jaw set hard. He pointed to a depression in the sand where a team had stopped to rest. "Look at the width. Look at the drag marks. They are moving the big guns." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "Field artillery, the mountain howitzers." "They do not bring those to catch a few horse thieves," Tane said. "They bring those to break rocks, to break villages." The realization hit them both with the force of a physical blow. Major Briggs was not hunting individuals. He was planning an extermination. He intended to shell the valley from the rim, raining explosive shells down on the lodges while the women and children slept, then send the cavalry in to finish off the survivors. "We have to warn them," Clara said, scrambling backward. "We have to move the camp." "Move where?" Tane asked, his voice bleak. "North is the river, guarded. East is the open plain. South is where the guns come from. We are boxed in." They rode back to the camp in a silence that felt heavy enough to break the horses' backs. When they arrived, the mood was already tense. The scouts had returned with similar news. In the central lodge, the air was thick with smoke and fear. Elder Red Elk sat by the fire, looking older than Clara had ever seen him. "We fight," a young warrior named Stonehand argued fiercely. "We ambushed them in the past." "They have 50 men, Tane countered, stepping into the light. "And they have the exploding guns. If we fight them in the past, we die. If we stay here, we die." "I can stop this," Clara said. Her voice shook, but she stepped into the center of the circle. The eyes of the council turned to her, some hostile, some desperate. Red Elk looked up. "How does the white girl stop the white man's thunder?" "It is illegal," Clara said, clutching her hands together. "What Briggs is doing?" "He is operating outside his jurisdiction. He is using army resources to clear land for a private railroad contract. If I can prove it, if I can get the evidence to the marshal in Santa Fe, or even show the soldiers that they are fighting for a crime, not for the flag." Red Elk laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You think paper stops bullets. You think your laws matter here. The white man's law is a spiderweb. It catches the fly. but the hawk flies right through it. I have to try, Clara insisted. She turned to Tana. My father, my brother, they are guiding them. If I can talk to them, if I can show them what Briggs is really doing, they might turn. Luke knows the terrain. If Luke refuses to guide them, the cannons cannot get through the narrow passes before dawn. Your brother sold you, Tane said, his voice hard. He left you to the wolves. He is my blood, Clara fired back, tears stinging her eyes. Just as these people are yours. I cannot let him become a murderer because he is afraid. She looked at Red Elk. I know where Briggs has made his forward camp. It is at my ranch. I saw the tracks leading back there. I can sneak in. There are papers. Briggs is arrogant. He keeps records of his victories. If I can steal the order of battle, or the contract with the railroad. And if you are caught, Red Elk asked. Then I am caught, Clara said. But I will not sit here and wait to be shelled. The council descended into murmurs. Finally. Red Elk waved a hand. Go, but do not expect us to wait for you. If the soldiers come, we will die with our knives in our hands, not waiting for a piece of paper. Tane followed Clara out to the horses. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and red. You are a fool, Tane said, grabbing Bessie's bridle as Clara mounted. Probably, Clara said. She looked down at him. Do not come with me, Tane. If they see you, they will shoot on sight. I have a chance. I am Monroe. Tane looked at her, his eyes searching her face. He reached up and touched her hand, a fleeting, desperate contact. If you do not come back by moon high? I will come back, Clara promised. She turned the horse and galloped toward the canyon exit. Tane watched her go until she was just a speck of dust against the darkening sky. The Monroe Ranch had been transformed. Rows of white canvas tents stood in the pasture where the foals used to play. A large command tent was erected near the burned-out shell of the barn. Pickets of horses were tied along the fence line, and the heavy, ominous shapes of 2 cannon carriages sat covered in tarps near the well. Clara tethered Bessie a mile out and made the rest of the approach on foot, moving through the brush with the silence Tane had taught her. She slipped past the sentries, who were lax, smoking tobacco and laughing about the turkey shoot scheduled for tomorrow morning. She reached the back of the main house, through the kitchen window. She saw movement. She crept to the door and pushed it open. It was unlocked. Inside. Thomas Monroe sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. A bottle of whiskey stood before him, half empty. Pa! Clara whispered. Thomas jerked upright, his eyes wild. He stared at her as if she were a ghost. Clara, good God! Clara! He scrambled up, knocking his chair over, and rushed to embrace her. He smelled of spirits and stale sweat. Briggs said the Comanches took you. He said you were likely dead. I'm alive, Clara said, pulling away. No thanks to the army. Pa, you have to listen to me. You have to leave, tonight. Leave? Thomas blinked, confused. Where, why? Briggs is going to massacre them. Clara hissed. At dawn. He is using our land to launch an illegal attack, and he is doing it for the railroad. Pa, not for safety, for money. I know, Thomas whispered, hanging his head. I know about the railroad. Clara froze. You know? He showed me the papers, Thomas stammered. He promised to rebuild the barn. He promised Luke a commission. Clara, we have no choice. They are going to take the land anyway. At least this way. At least this way you get paid for the blood, Clara asked, her voice trembling with disgust. You do not understand. The voice came from the doorway. Luke stood there, wearing a new coat that looked too expensive for a ranch hand. He held a lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other. Luke, Clara said, stepping back. You are alive, Luke said flatly. I suppose that makes things complicated. Luke, listen to me, Clara pleaded. Tane and his people. They are not the ones who burned the barn. It was Briggs's men. I saw them. I saw the uniforms under the disguises. Stop it, Luke snapped. Stop defending them. You have been with them for weeks. What did they do to you? Did they turn you? They saved me, Clara shouted. "They treated me with more honor than you did. You are guiding a slaughter. Luke, do you know there are children in that valley?" "There are always children," Luke yelled, his face flushing red. "And they grow up to be warriors who steal our horses and scare off investors. It is us or them. Clara, that is how the world works. I am choosing us. You are choosing a murderer," Clara said. She looked at her father. "Pa, please." Thomas looked away, tears streaming down his face, but he did not move. He was a broken man, crushed by the weight of inevitable progress. Clara realized then that she could not save them. She could only save the truth. "I am leaving," she said, backing toward the door. "You are not going anywhere," Luke said, raising the gun. "Major Briggs needs to know you are here." Clara didn't think. She grabbed the whiskey bottle from the table and hurled it at Luke. It shattered against the wall next to his head, spraying glass and liquor. Luke flinched, firing a shot into the ceiling. Clara bolted. She ran out the back door, sprinting toward the command tent. She knew the layout of the camp. She knew Briggs would keep the plans close. "Guard intruder!" Luke's voice rang out behind her. Clara dove under the canvas flap of the command tent. It was empty. Briggs must have been at the officers' mess. A lantern burned low on a field desk. She scrambled to the desk. Maps were spread out. One showed the valley, with red arrows marking the artillery positions. And there, under a paperweight, was a document with the seal of the Silver Star Railroad Company. Agreement of sale and transfer Monroe Ranch and adjacent territories. She grabbed the map and the contract, stuffing them into her bodice. She turned to leave, but the tent flap was swept aside. Major Briggs stood there. He was smiling, but it was the smile of a wolf who had cornered a rabbit. "Miss Monroe," he purred, "I was hoping you would return." "It saves me the trouble of hunting you down." Clara tried to dodge past him, but he was faster than he looked. He grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back with brutal efficiency. "Let me go!" she screamed. "I think not," Briggs said. He dragged her out of the tent, into the torchlight where soldiers were now gathering. Luke and Thomas came running up. "She has the papers," Luke shouted, pointing at her. Briggs reached into her dress and ripped the documents out. He glanced at them and laughed. "A valiant effort, my dear, truly." He handed the papers to a sergeant. "Burn these!" "No!" Clara screamed. Briggs spun her around, slapping her hard across the face. The blow knocked her to the ground. She tasted blood. "Tie her up," Briggs commanded. He pointed to a hitching post in the center of the yard, illuminated by the campfire. "Tie her tight." Two soldiers hauled her up and dragged her to the post. They lashed her wrists to the wood, leaving her exposed to the staring eyes of the regiment. "Now," Briggs said, addressing the gathered men. "We have a dilemma. Our scout," he gestured to Luke, "is having a crisis of conscience, and the terrain is difficult. We need to be sure of our approach." He walked over to Clara, grabbing a handful of her hair and yanking her head back. "You have been living with them," Briggs whispered in her ear. "You know the back trails. You know where they sleep." "I will never tell you," Clara spat, blood flecking his pristine uniform. "Oh, you will," Briggs said. He turned to Thomas Monroe. "Mr. Monroe, your daughter is a traitor. The penalty for treason is death by hanging. However, I am a merciful man. If you tell me exactly where the main camp is located, not just the valley, but the specific layout, I will spare her life. I will send her to a convent in the east." "Pa, don't!" Clara cried out. "He is lying. He will kill us all anyway." Thomas stood trembling, looking from his daughter to the major. "Major, please, she is just a girl." "She is a spy," Briggs said coldly. He drew his revolver and placed the cold barrel against Clara's temple. He cocked the hammer. The click echoed in the silence. "You have 10 seconds, Thomas, or you can watch her brains paint this post. 1, 2. From the darkness beyond the ring of torchlight, a coyote howled. It was a lonely, mournful sound, but then it changed. It pitched up into a sharp, staccato yip that didn't sound like an animal at all. Briggs paused. "What was that?" "Thwip." An arrow materialized from the night and slammed into the wood of the post. 2 inches from Briggs's nose. "Contact!" a sentry screamed. "Perimeter breached!" Chaos erupted. From the darkness, flaming arrows rained down not on the soldiers, but on the dry canvas of the tents and the hay bales near the horses. The army horses, terrified by the fire, began to scream and tear at their pickets. "Form ranks!" Briggs roared, shoving Clara aside. "Defend the guns!" But the attack was not coming from one direction. It was everywhere. Shadows moved in the smoke. Clara struggled against her bonds. "Tane," she whispered. He had come. Through the swirling smoke, a figure vaulted over the fence. He moved with a terrifying fluidity, a tomahawk in one hand and a knife in the other. It was Tan. He did not stop to fight the soldiers. He sprinted straight for Clara. "Tane, look out!" Clara screamed as a soldier lunged at him with a bayonet. Tane ducked, sweeping the soldier's legs out from under him, and slammed the pommel of his knife into the man's jaw. He reached Clara and slashed the ropes binding her wrists. "Run!" Tane shouted, pulling her up. "No!" Clara grabbed his arm. "The cannons. If we run, they will still march at dawn. We have to stop the guns." Tane looked at the 2 massive howitzers sitting near the well. The crews were trying to hitch horses to them to move them to safety. "The powder," Tane said, understanding immediately. They ran toward the artillery. The smoke from the burning tents was thick, confusing the soldiers. Luke was shouting orders, trying to rally the men, but Thomas was cowering on the porch. Clara saw a caisson, the box holding the ammunition, sitting open next to the nearest cannon. "Cover me!" she yelled to Tane. She snatched a burning brand from a collapsed tent. Tane turned, drawing his bow. He fired 3 arrows in rapid succession, dropping 2 soldiers who were rushing toward them. Clara reached the cannon. She didn't try to blow up the ammo that would kill everyone, including her father. Instead, she threw the torch into the pile of hay beneath the caisson carriage. The dry grass caught instantly. "Fire in the battery!" an artilleryman screamed, abandoning his post. The horses hitched to the cannon and panicked. They reared, snapping the traces, and bolted. Dragging the heavy gun carriage sideways, the cannon tipped, one of its massive wheels shattering the wooden axle of the second gun carriage next to it. The heavy iron barrel of the first gun slid off, crashing into the dirt with a sound like a church bell falling. "The carriage is broken," a soldier shouted. "They are useless." Briggs emerged from the smoke, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wild with rage. He saw Clara and Tane standing by the wrecked guns. "Kill them!" Briggs screamed, leveling his revolver. "Shoot them down!" Tane grabbed Clara and pulled her behind the overturned caisson just as Briggs fired. The bullet sparked off the iron rim of the wheel. Clara looked around. The camp was in disarray. Soldiers were running everywhere, fighting phantom shadows. But Briggs was rallying a squad. They were trapped. "We need a way out," Tane hissed, checking his quiver. "I have 2 arrows left." Clara looked at the confused soldiers. They weren't shooting yet. They were waiting for orders, terrified of the fire and the savage attack. She realized this was her only chance. She stood up. "Clara, no!" Tane lunged for her, but she stepped out from behind the caisson, right into the line of fire. "Stop!" she screamed. Her voice was shrill, desperate, cutting through the noise. She pointed a finger straight at Major Briggs. "Look at him!" she shouted to the soldiers. "Look at your major! He just tried to kill my father to hide his crime!" The soldiers hesitated. Their rifles wavered. "She is lying!" Briggs roared. "Fire! Damn you!" "I saw the contract!" Clara yelled, her voice breaking. "He sold this land to the railroad. He is using you. He wants to clear the valley so he can get paid. There is no rebellion. There is only one sale." She looked at the young private nearest to her, a boy no older than 18, his face pale with fear. "Is this why you enlisted?" Clara asked him, panting. "To murder women and children so Major Briggs can get rich." The private looked at Briggs, then at the contract burning in the fire nearby, only half consumed. The seal of the railroad was clearly visible on the unburnt corner. "Major," the private asked, lowering his rifle, "is that true?" "This is mutiny!" Briggs screamed. He aimed his gun at the private. That was the mistake. In the moment, Briggs turned his gun on his own man. The spell of authority broke. Taney stood up beside Clara. He did not draw his weapon. He stood tall, fierce, and utterly unafraid. "The white man eats his own," Tane said loudly, his voice carrying over the crackle of the flames. Thomas Monroe suddenly ran from the porch. He was unarmed, but he threw himself between Briggs and the private. "It is true," Thomas sobbed. "I signed it. He forced me. He burned the barn. It was him." Briggs pulled the trigger. The shot hit Thomas in the shoulder, spinning the old man around. "Pa!" Clara screamed, but the shot had sealed Briggs's fate. He had fired on a civilian. He had fired on a white settler in front of his own troops. The soldiers did not fire at Tana. They did not fire at Clara. They stood still, their weapons lowering. Briggs looked around, realizing he had lost the room. He realized the smoke was clearing, and he was standing alone with a smoking gun. "You fools!" Briggs hissed. He backed away toward his horse, but Taney was faster. He snatched a discarded lariat from the ground. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the loop flying. It settled over Briggs's shoulders. Tane yanked hard. Briggs was jerked off his feet, crashing into the dust. The battle for the valley was over. The battle for the soul of the territory had just begun. The lasso had jerked Major Briggs to the ground, but he was a man fueled by a desperate, venomous rage, and the dust of the corral was his familiar battlefield. He did not stay down. As Taney moved to secure him, Briggs rolled, his spurs flashing in the chaotic light of the burning tents. He slashed at the rope with a hidden boot knife, severing the hemp with a savage jerk, and scrambled to his feet. He was no longer the composed officer in the polished tunic. He was a cornered animal. His eyes darted around the circle of confused soldiers, seeing his authority evaporating like water on a hot skillet. He saw the doubt in their faces. He saw the disgust, and he saw the cause of it all standing 10 feet away, the savage who had humiliated him, and the girl who had exposed him. "You!" Briggs snarled, his voice cracking. He raised his revolver again. His hand was shaking, but at this range, he did not need to be steady. He aimed not at Clara, but at Tan. "You filthy red dog!" Time seemed to slow down for Clara. She saw the hammer of the Colt peacemaker pull back. She saw Taney bracing himself, his knife raised, but he was too far away to strike before the bullet flew. He stood tall, accepting his death with a terrifying stillness. Clara did not think. She did not calculate. She simply threw herself forward. She slammed into Tane just as the gun roared. The impact knocked them both sideways into the mud churned up by the panicked horses. The sound of the bullet hitting flesh was not a sharp crack, but a dull, wet thud. Tane grunted, a sound of surprise more than pain, and collapsed onto his side. Blood, dark and arterial, immediately began to bloom on the shoulder of his buckskin shirt, rapidly soaking the fabric. "No!" Clara screamed, scrambling over him, pressing her hands against the wound. "Tane!" Briggs laughed, a sound devoid of sanity. He cocked the gun again, walking toward them where they lay tangled in the dirt. "2 birds," he muttered. "1 stone. Drop it, Nathaniel." The voice was weak, raspy, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. Briggs froze. He turned slowly. Thomas Monroe stood on the edge of the porch. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, blood dripping from his own shoulder where Briggs had shot him moments before. His face was gray, the color of old ash, but his right hand was steady. He held his heavy buffalo rifle, and the barrel was leveled directly at the major's chest. "Thomas," Briggs said, his voice dropping to a persuasive purr, though his eyes remained cold. "Think about what you are doing. You are pointing a weapon at a superior officer. That is treason." "You are not an officer," Thomas said, coughing, a spatter of blood hitting his chin. "You are a land speculator in a uniform, and you just tried to kill my daughter." "I am securing the future," Briggs shouted, gesturing with his free hand to the burning camp. "Look at this. This is chaos. I am bringing order." "You are bringing death," Thomas said. He pulled the hammer back on the rifle. The click was loud enough to be heard over the crackle of the fire. "Drop the gun, or so help me God. I will put a hole in you the size of a dinner plate." Briggs hesitated. He looked at Thomas, then at the soldiers. "Sergeant," Briggs barked. "Arrest this man. Shoot him." No one moved. Near the command tent, Luke Monroe was kneeling in the dirt. He was holding the charred remains of the contract Clara had tried to save. The firelight flickered over the paper, illuminating the damning words, "Transfer of title. Immediate liquidation of livestock. Commission for services rendered." Luke looked up. His face was pale, stripped of the arrogance that had worn it for weeks. He looked at the burning barn the second time it had burned in a month. He looked at his father, bleeding on the porch. He looked at Clara, kneeling in the mud, her hands pressed to the chest of a Comanche warrior. He had wanted to be important. He had wanted to be part of the new world. But he realized now, with a sickening lurch in his gut, that he was just the tool used to destroy the old one. "Stand down, Major," Luke said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. Briggs spun around. "You too? Boy, after everything I gave you, you gave me nothing," Luke said. Standing up, he threw the papers onto the ground. "You sold my home, you sold my family, and you made me watch." Luke drew his own pistol, not pointing it at his father, but letting it hang by his side, a clear signal that he was no longer Briggs's man. The young private who Briggs had threatened earlier took a step forward. "Sir," the boy said, his voice trembling but determined. "Put the weapon down." Briggs looked at the ring of faces. He saw no allies. He saw only witnesses. A scream of pure, incoherent rage tore from his throat. He did not drop the gun. Instead, he lunged, not at Thomas, who was armed, not at the soldiers. He lunged at Clara. If he was going down, he was going to take the witness the cause of his ruin with him. "Clara!" Thomas shouted, firing his rifle. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt. As Thomas's injured shoulder gave way, Briggs collided with Clara, knocking her backward into the mud. He was heavy, smelling of sweat and expensive cologne and madness. His hands went for her throat, but before he could squeeze, a shadow rose from the earth. Tane, bleeding and gray-faced with shock, launched himself at Briggs. He did not use a weapon. He used his body, slamming into the Major with the force of a battering ram. They rolled in the mud, a tangle of blue wool and buckskin. Briggs was fresh and heavy. Tane was wounded and exhausted. But Tane fought with a ferocity that Briggs could not match. It was the fighting style of a man who had nothing left to lose. Briggs struck Tane in the wound, driving his fist into the shattered flesh. Tane cried out, a guttural sound of agony, but he did not let go. He drove his knee into Briggs's stomach, doubling the man over, then smashed his forehead into the Major's nose. Bone crunched. Briggs flailed back, blinded by pain and blood. Tane scrambled on top of him, his hand finding a rock in the mud. He raised it high, his eyes burning with a cold, killing light. This was the man who had burned the land. This was the man who had shot Thomas. This was the man who had tried to kill Clara. "Tane, no!" Clara's voice cut through the red haze. She crawled toward him, grabbing his raised arm. Her hands were slippery with mud and his blood. "Do not kill him," she sobbed. "Do not let him make you a murderer. He is defeated. Look!" Tane froze, his arm trembling under the weight of the rock. He looked down. Briggs was barely conscious, gasping for air, his face a ruin of blood and mud. He looked pathetic. Then Tane looked up. He was surrounded. The soldiers had circled them, rifles raised, but they were not firing. Thomas was leaning against the porch rail, weeping silently. Luke was walking toward them, his hands raised in surrender. Tane lowered the rock. He let it drop into the mud with a wet plop. He rolled off Briggs and collapsed onto his back, staring up at the smoke-choked stars. His chest heaved. His shoulder was a spreading stain of dark fire. "Secure him," the young private ordered. 2 soldiers rushed forward. not to help Briggs, but to drag him up and bind his hands behind his back with rough efficiency. They hauled him away toward the stockade wagon. Ignoring his mumbled threats of court-martial, the battle was over. The silence that followed was louder than the gunfire. The rain came an hour later. It started as a drizzle, then turned into a steady, cleansing downpour that hissed against the dying embers of the tents and washed the blood from the hard-packed earth of the yard. The army retreated to the far side of the creek to regroup and wait for orders from Santa Fe. They took Briggs with them, a prisoner of his own command. But the ranch was no place for Tana. The soldiers, though mutinous against Briggs, were still soldiers. They could not harbor a hostile indefinitely. Clara and Luke helped move Tane to a temporary shelter, a lean-to constructed from the canvas of a salvaged tent, set up near the tree line, halfway between the ranch and the open plain. It was neutral ground. Inside, the air was damp and cold. Luke had brought a lantern and a first aid kit from the house, but he could not bring himself to stay. He stood at the entrance, looking at Taney lying on the blankets. Luke started, his voice thick. I did not know he would shoot. You knew enough, Tane whispered. His eyes closed. Luke flinched as if he had been struck. He looked at Clara. I will bring more water, and I will keep the soldiers away. He turned and walked into the rain, a man carrying a burden heavier than any pack. Clara turned to Tane. He was shivering. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving him in shock. His skin was clammy, and the wound on his shoulder was ugly, a jagged tear where the bullet had plowed through the muscle. I have to sew it, Clara said, her voice trembling. She threaded a needle from the kit, sterilizing it in the flame of the lantern. Do it, Tane gritted out. Clara cut away the ruined shirt. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped the scissors twice. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She looked at the wound. It echoed the injuries she had read about in stories, the kind heroes got, but this wasn't a story. This was warm flesh, torn and bleeding. I might hurt you, she whispered. Tane opened his eyes. They were glassy with pain, but they focused on her face. You cannot hurt me. Clara, you saved me. Clara touched the skin around the wound. You took the bullet. You jumped in front of him. You shoved me, Tane corrected, a faint, strained smile touching his lips. You tried to be the shield. I am Monroe, she said, tears spilling onto her cheeks. We are stubborn. So, Tane said softly. Clara began to stitch. The needle pierced the tough skin, and Tane's body went rigid, every muscle standing out in relief as he fought the urge to pull away. He did not cry out. He breathed through his teeth, a sharp, hissing sound. Clara worked through her tears. Every stitch felt like she was sewing her own guilt into him. She was the one who had brought him here. She was the one whose family had caused this war. I am shaking, she whispered, the words tumbling out just as they had in the canyon. Tane reached up with his good hand. His fingers were cold, but his grip was strong. He covered her hand, stopping the tremor. We are alive, he said. The shaking means we are alive. He held her hand against his chest until she steadied. Then she finished the work, bandaging the shoulder with clean linen. She sat back on her heels, exhausted. Her dress was ruined, stiff with mud and blood. Her hair hung in wet rat tails around her face. She felt hollowed out. Will you leave? She asked into the darkness. We must, Tane said. Briggs is gone, but the railroad is not. The Iron Snake still comes. The Blue Coats will send a new chief. Maybe he is better, maybe he is worse, but he will still have orders. So it was for nothing, Clara asked bitterly. We fought, we bled, and you still lose your land. We lose the valley, Tane said, but we keep our lives, and we keep our honor. That is not nothing. The flap of the tent opened. Red Elk ducked inside. He was wet, his blanket heavy with rain. He looked at Tana, then at Clara. He did not scowl. He did not spit. He looked at the bandage on Tane's shoulder, then at the bloody needle in Clara's hand. The soldiers say the bad chief is tied up. Red Elk said in English. It was the first time Clara had heard him speak her language. He is, Clara said. Good. Red Elk grunted. He sat down near Tane's feet. We move at first light. The canyon to the west is deep. The horses can hide there. Tane looked at the elder, conflict warring in his face. Grandfather, I brought the white girl. I fought alongside the soldiers to stop the bad chief. Did I betray our blood? Clara held her breath. This was the question that had been haunting Tane since he first pulled her onto his horse. Red Elk looked at Tane for a long time. He reached out and touched the warrior's good shoulder. The wolf fights with its teeth, Red Elk said. The hawk fights with claws. You fought with what you had. You fought for the helpless. That is the Comanche way. He turned his gaze to Clara. It was a heavy, measuring look. And you, Red Elk said, you fought your own father's blood to save ours. Why, Clara looked down at her hands, stained with Tane's blood. Because it was right, she whispered. Because looking away was easier. But it was not living. I did not want to be safe anymore. I wanted to be clean. Red Elk nodded slowly. Then you are not white. You are not Comanche. You are just human. That is a hard thing to be in this world. He stood up. Rest. The journey tomorrow is long. When he left, the silence in the tent shifted. It was no longer the silence of survival. It was the silence of two people standing on the edge of a precipice, realizing the bridge behind them had burned down. Clara lay down on the blankets beside Tun. She was careful not to touch his shoulder. She curled into his side, seeking his warmth. I cannot stay here, she whispered. My father, Luke, I cannot look at them and not see the gun. I cannot see the contract. Then do not stay, Tane said. Where do I go? You have a horse, Tane said. You have a bow. You have a scar on your heart, just like us. He turned his head so his cheek rested against her hair. The wind blows everywhere. Clara, we just follow it. Clara closed her eyes. She thought of the town, with its starch and its rumors. She thought of the ranch, which would eventually be swallowed by the smoke of the trains. And she thought of the open plains, dangerous and hungry, but vast enough to hold a soul without crushing it. She realized then that justice wasn't a gavel banging in a courtroom. Justice was this: a needle and thread, a hand in the dark, and the choice to stand in the rain with the one person who understood the storm. I am not going back, she said, her voice steady for the first time that night. Good, Tane murmured, sleep finally claiming him. Because I cannot shoot the bow with one arm. Clara smiled, a watery, fragile thing, and pressed her face into the rough wool of the blanket. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the New Mexico dust into mud, preparing the earth for whatever would grow next. The dust from the departing army column hung in the air for 3 days, a persistent haze that refused to settle. It was as if the valley itself was trying to cough up the memory of Major Nathaniel Briggs. He had been taken away in the back of a supply wagon, his wrists bound with iron, his uniform stripped of its epaulets. The official report, filed by a captain sent down from Santa Fe to clean up the mess, spoke of gross misconduct and misappropriation of military assets. The rumors that swirled through the territory were far less polite. In the saloons of Silver City and the trading posts along the Pecos River, men spoke of the officer who had tried to sell a war to a railroad company. They whispered about the land contracts found in the ashes and the white rancher he had shot in front of his own troops. Briggs would likely avoid the hangman's noose men of his rank often did, but his career was dead. The hero of the frontier was now just another corrupt ghost in a land crowded with them. For the Monroe family, the departure of the army brought a silence that was both welcome and terrifying. The ranch was a ruin. The barn was ash, the fences were broken, and the house was riddled with bullet holes. But the land remained. Thomas Monroe sat on his porch for a week, staring at the scars on the earth. His arm was in a sling, the wound in his shoulder a constant, throbbing reminder of his moment of truth. He had aged 10 years in 10 days. We cannot stay here, he said one evening as Clara changed his bandages. I know, Clara said softly. The railroad will come eventually, Thomas said, his voice raspy. Briggs is gone, but the company has the survey maps. They know the water is here. If we stay, we will be fighting lawyers and hiring guns until the day I die. Where do we go? Clara asked. We have no money to start over in the east. Thomas looked out toward the west, toward the jagged spine of the mountains where the sun was setting in a blaze of violent orange. We do not go east, he said. We go where the iron snake cannot follow. We go deeper. It was a decision born of necessity, but also of a new, fragile understanding. Thomas sold 2/3 of his remaining herd to an independent drover passing through from Texas. The money was not a fortune, but it was enough to buy supplies, ammunition, and a team of sturdy mules. They packed what could be salvaged from the house. They left the scorched timber of the barn where it lay, a monument to the price of greed. And then, they moved. They did not move back to the safety of the town. They moved 10 miles west, into the rugged, broken foothills that marked the edge of the Comanche territory. It was a place of high mesas and deep, hidden canyons, a place where the grass was tough and the water was hard to find. It was land that the railroad engineers deemed impassable and commercially non-viable. It was perfect. They built a new cabin in a box canyon protected by towering red cliffs. It was rougher than the old place, smaller and more primitive. But for the first time in years, the air tasted clean. Crucially, they were not alone. 3 miles away, across a ridge of limestone, the Comanche band had settled into their winter camp. There was no treaty signed in Washington to validate this arrangement. There were no surveyors drawing lines on a map. It was a buffer zone created by mutual survival. The Monroe cattle grazed in the lower valley. The Comanche ponies grazed on the high mesas. It was a peace held together not by paper, but by the memory of a shared battle. Luke Monroe was the most changed by the new order. The young man who had once dreamed of wearing a uniform and drinking brandy in officers' clubs now wore buckskins and let his beard grow out. The shame of his betrayal burned in him, a fire that no apology could extinguish. He knew that words were cheap, so he stopped speaking and started doing. Every morning, Luke rode out before dawn. He checked the perimeter of both the ranch and the Comanche camp. He fixed fences that weren't his. He hauled water when the creek ran low. One afternoon, Clara watched from the porch as Luke rode into the yard. He was not alone. Tane was riding beside him. The image stopped her breath. Her brother and the warrior, riding stirrup to stirrup. They were not talking. The gulf between them was still wide, but there was a lack of tension in their posture. He tracks well, Tane said as they dismounted. It was the first time he had spoken directly to Luke in weeks. Luke looked down at his boots, flushing slightly. I missed the sign of the mountain lion near the South Wash. You saw the broken twig, Tane corrected. You just looked at the tree instead of the ground. Next time, look down. It was a small thing, a correction given from a teacher to a student, but to Clara, it sounded like a hymn. Luke nodded, accepting the instruction without the defensive arrogance that used to define him. He was learning that respect in this land was earned by competence, not by bloodline or ambition. Clara walked down the steps to meet them. Tane looked at her. His shoulder was still stiff, and he favored his left arm, but he was healing. The dark bruise on his jaw where Briggs had struck him had faded to a sickly yellow. The shoulder, Clara asked. It pulls when I lift the saddle, Tane admitted. But it holds. Dr. Clara did good work, Luke mumbled, taking the reins of Tane's horse to lead it to the water trough. It was a peace offering doing the menial labor for the guest. Tane watched him go, a thoughtful expression on his face. Your brother is trying to wash the black paint from his soul. He is trying, Clara said. It will take time. We have time, Tane said. He looked at the high cliffs surrounding them. The snow will come soon. The army will not march into these rocks until spring. By then, we will be ghosts. And what about us? Clara asked. Are we ghosts too? Tane turned his full attention to her. The intensity in his eyes had not dimmed, but the wariness was gone. No, we are the stone the ghosts walk on. A week later, on a warm afternoon that smelled of pine needles and drying sage, Clara and Tane sat by the banks of the narrow stream that fed the canyon. It was a rare moment of stillness. There were no soldiers to track, no cattle to herd, no wounds to dress. Clara held a small slate board in her lap, a relic from her school days. She used a piece of chalk to write a word. "Horse," she said, pointing to the letters. Tane looked at the squiggles. "Horse," he repeated. "They're rolling in his throat." He pointed to the animal grazing nearby. "Puku." Clara erased the board and wrote again. "Puku," she said, trying to mimic his intonation. Tane laughed, a low, rich sound that rumbled in his chest. "No, you say it like a sneeze. Puku. Soft. My tongue is too clumsy." Clara smiled. "Your tongue is fine," Tane said. "It just thinks in straight lines. Comanche is round, like the wind." He took the chalk from her hand. His fingers brushed hers, warm and rough. He drew a crude circle on the slate, then a line through it. "This is how the white man thinks," Tane said. "He draws a line. This side is mine, that side is yours. He cuts the world." He wiped the slate clean with his thumb. He drew a spiral, starting from the center and winding outward. "This is how we think," he said. "Everything touches everything. The rain touches the grass touches the buffalo touches the man. If you cut the line, you kill the circle." Clara looked at the spiral. She thought of Briggs and his contracts, his obsession with boundaries and ownership. And she thought of the buffer zone they were living in now, a place where the lines were blurred, where a white family and a Comanche band shared the same water. "I am learning," Clara whispered, "but it is hard to unlearn the lines." "You have already unlearned them," Tane said. He set the slate down on the grass. "When you stood in front of the gun, when you grabbed the rock, you did not see lines. You saw life." He leaned back on his elbows, looking up at the sky. "I used to hate the white face," he admitted quietly. "I looked at you and saw only the people who killed my cousins. I saw the people who brought the sickness and the whiskey." "And now?" Clara asked, her heart beating a little faster. "Now," Tane said, turning his head to look at her, "I see the woman who sewed my flesh back together. I see the woman who shakes." Clara flushed. "I was terrified." "Fear is the wet clay," Tane said. "Courage is the fire that bakes it into a pot. You are a strong pot. Clara Monroe." It was a strange compliment, clumsy in its translation, but Clara cherished it more than any sonnet she had ever read. She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the fine lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. She saw the way his hair fell across his forehead. She saw the scar on his shoulder, a puckered pink mark that she had put there with her needle. She realized then how far she had come. A month ago, she was a girl who worried about the price of flour and the gossip of the town matrons. She was a girl waiting for a husband to be chosen for her, a girl standing on the edge of her own life, watching it happen. Now, she was a participant. She was a survivor. "I do not miss it," she said suddenly. "Miss what?" "The town, the dresses with the hoops. The tea parties where no one says what they mean." She picked up a pebble and tossed it into the stream. I thought I would miss being safe." "Safety is a cage," Tane said. "The bird in the cage is safe from the hawk, but it cannot fly." "I would rather fly," Clara said. Tane sat up. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm, grounding. "Then fly, but do not fly too far. The wind is strong here." The sky turned dark quickly, the blue fading into a heavy, bruised charcoal. The air grew thick and electric. A summer storm was rolling off the peaks, moving with the sudden violence of the high desert weather. "Rain," Tane said, standing up and pulling Clara with him. "It comes fast." They gathered the horses and rode back to the Monroe cabin. By the time they reached the yard, the first fat drops were hitting the dust, kicking up tiny puffs of steam. Luke and Thomas were already inside, securing the shutters. Tane did not go to his horse to ride back to his camp. It was too late. The storm was upon them. He stood with Clara under the overhang of the porch roof. The rain began to fall in sheets, a gray curtain that obliterated the world beyond the fence line. Thunder cracked, shaking the ground beneath their boots. It was a deluge. The dry earth drank it greedily. The smell of wet creosote and ozone filled the air, the scent of renewal. Clara leaned against the rough log wall of the cabin, watching the water pour off the eaves. Taney stood next to her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body. Flashbacks hit her. The canyon, the crevice, the weight of him pressing her into the dirt while men with guns hunted them. The terror of that moment, the way her body had betrayed her with its uncontrollable trembling. She looked at Tana. He was watching the rain, his profile sharp against the gray light. He seemed to sense her gaze, for he turned. Water dripped from the edge of the roof, landing on his shoulder, soaking into the buckskin. "Do you remember?" Clara asked softly, her voice barely audible over the drumming of the rain. "In the rocks," Taney nodded. "I remember everything." "I was so scared," Clara said. "I thought my heart was going to break my ribs." She looked down at her hands. They were steady now, rougher than they used to be, stained with garden soil and horsetack, but steady. "I was shaking then," she whispered, repeating the words that had passed between them in the dark. Taney moved closer. He turned his body so that he was shielding her from the spray of the wind-blown rain. Just as he had done in the sandstorm, just as he had done in the canyon. But this time, there was no enemy. There was only the weather, and the choice to stand in it. He reached out and placed his hand on her forehead, his thumb brushing her temple. He tilted her head up so she had to look at him. His eyes were dark pools, endless and deep. "We still are," Tane murmured, his voice a low rumble that matched the thunder. "Inside, the shaking never stops. Clara, it is the blood moving. It is the spirit dancing." He slid his hand down to cup her cheek. His skin was cool from the rain, but his touch burned. "But now," he said, stepping into the space that separated them, closing the final distance. "We do not have to hide it." He lowered his head. Clara did not pull away. She did not freeze. She rose on her toes to meet him. The kiss was not like the storms that surrounded them. It was not violent or hurried. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was the taste of rain and salt and sage. It was a question asked and answered in the same breath. His lips were soft, surprisingly so. For a man who lived such a hard life, he kissed her with a reverence that made her knees weak. But he did not try to possess her. He did not grab her or hold her tight. He simply stood with her, sharing the breath, sharing the moment. It was a kiss between equals. Clara brought her hands up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heart. It beat in time with hers, two different rhythms, syncing up in the chaos of the storm. When they pulled apart, they did not step back. They stayed there, foreheads touching, eyes closed, listening to the rain wash the world clean. "No lines," Clara whispered. "No lines," Tane agreed. "Only the circle." The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the sky a brilliant, scoured blue. The sun broke through the clouds, turning the wet grass of the valley into a field of diamonds. The New Mexico territory was changing. The railroad would come. The towns would grow. The fences would multiply. The old ways were dying, fading like the buffalo herds that were becoming memories on the wind. But in this hidden canyon, in the shadow of the red rocks, something new had taken root. It was not a victory in the history books. Briggs would be a footnote. The Monroe Ranch would be a speck on a surveyor's map. But for the people living it, it was everything. Clara stood on the porch, watching Taney mount his horse to return to his camp. He raised a hand in farewell, not a wave, but a salute, a promise to return tomorrow. She raised her hand in return. She was no longer the innocent girl from the east. She was no longer the prisoner in the desert. She was Clara. She was a woman who knew how to shoot a bow, how to sew a wound, and how to love without asking permission from the world. She looked at her father, who was sitting in his chair, whittling a piece of cedar with his good hand. a look of peace on his face that had been missing for years. She looked at Luke, who was down in the corral, talking to the mules in a low, gentle voice. They had lost their home to find their house. They had lost their safety to find their freedom. Freedom, Clara realized, was not a place. It was not a deed to a plot of land. Freedom was the ability to stand in the storm and not look for a place to hide. It was the price you paid for the right to choose whose hand you held when the thunder started. And looking at the retreating figure of the Comanche warrior riding tall against the vast, open sky, Clara knew she had paid the price, and she would pay it again, 1,000 times over. The West was wild. It was cruel. It was unforgiving. But it was theirs. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed this journey through the dust, the danger, and the romance of the American frontier. It has been a long ride from the burning barn to this quiet canyon, and I'm so glad you came along with Clara and Tana. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you are listening from. Are you in a busy city dreaming of open plains? Are you in a quiet town like Dust Creek? Let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel. Wild West Tales. Hit that like button if you felt the heat of the desert. And smash that hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these campfire stories alive. Until the next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.